My name's Jon Pigott, and the work that I've made for the Eastern DC Festival in Cardiff is called Resonant Forms. The work I've been developing for Eastern DC is a series of sculptural loudspeakers which have been uniquely designed with respect to both their visual and their sonic characteristics. The idea of the speakers is that they form a kind of gallery-based sound system that can be used to reproduce fixed media sound art created by both myself and in collaboration with other artists and composers. You can see from these images the kind of materials and the visual approach that I've taken to the creation of the loudspeaker boxes. Inside the speaker boxes, the drivers are unusual in that they're a type of coneless loudspeaker driver, a transducer which doesn't have any speaker cone attached to it, and you can see those on the right hand side there. On the left hand side you can see the way I've approached creating my own speaker diaphragms using handmade frames and different flexible resonant materials that introduce unusual frequency responses and distortions to the sonic characteristics of the loudspeakers. The context and motivation for this work comes from a whole range of quite different sources, from the world of sound art, experimental music, as well as more visual cultures as well. I just want to touch on a few of those key kind of contextual motivating projects now. The first one is David Tudor, the composer and pianist, who developed a piece of work called Rainforest, which came about in the late 1960s and was realised in a number of different ways in a number of different locations and venues. It's kind of well known that the inspiration for Tudor's Rainforest came from this little article in a Popular Mechanics magazine in the mid-60s, where there was an article about fantastic coneless loudspeakers that can turn doors into speakers, fill swimming pools with sound, and make desks into speakers, etc., etc. So on seeing this article, Tudor was given the inspiration to make the Rainforest piece, which was essentially a large installation that turned found objects, and you can see some of those objects here in the image on the left. Oil drums, cartwheels, bits of sheet metal, etc., etc. And he turned those objects into loudspeakers using these coneless transducers that he'd seen advertised in Popular Mechanics magazine. There's other examples of similar kinds of work in the world of sound art and experimental music. Gordon Monaghan has done a number of pieces. There's a couple shown here. They're essentially doing a very similar thing. They're turning objects and materials into unusual types of loudspeaker and using the kind of resonant characteristics of those objects as part of the sonic landscape of the work. And there's also kind of industrial music, technological inspiration and motivation for my work. Here's a couple of historic examples. The Ons Martineau, an early electronic keyboard instrument, also included as part of the system a series of unusual loudspeakers. The idea was to kind of further explore possibilities of sound manipulation during the days of early sound synthesis. And one of the ways that Martineau approached this with his instrument was to couple loudspeakers to gongs, strings, and to diffuse the sound through unusual methods of sound diffusion. A little bit later, a very interesting and quite well known example of loudspeakers that use mechanical manipulation to change the sound is the Leslie rotating loudspeaker, often thought of as belonging to the Hammond organ, and you can see here the rotating drum that kind of gives a chorus type effect coming forward from the loudspeaker there. I'm also interested in the sort of visual impact of some industrial loudspeaker manufacturing. You can see here these kind of monolithic towers of bass bins that you would perhaps connect with the sort of sound system culture. Here's more examples here, kind of sometimes referred to as scoop bins. I also see that same kind of visual language in some of the work of sculptor Donald Judd, American minimalist sculptor who came to prominence in the 1960s, and certainly the way that Judd kind of divides up internal spaces and creates pathways through space and separates spaces in some of these examples here echoes some of the speakers we were looking at in the previous slides. And also some more day-to-day influences on my resonant form loudspeakers, such as the kind of speaker grills you might find in elevators or in domestic radios, speaker enclosures such as those designed by Dieter Rams for companies like Braun since the 1960s, and the kind of horns you get in standard industrial public address systems, as well as other sort of influences from the world of musical instrument design. We can see some drawings of early organ pipe designs here. And through to larger, even architectural influences on my speaker designs, such as are shown here in these images of the urban environment, underpasses, subways, enclosed spaces and so on, all of which have an impact on the acoustic characteristic. One of the key ideas of my loudspeakers is that they're to be used collaboratively and that composers can work with them to use them to create new possibilities within their sound compositions. I've already been able to do this once or twice over the last year or so, most notably at the Borealis Festival of Experimental Music and Sound Art in Bergen in Norway, where two international composers worked for around a week each on the sound system, and the work was premiered at the festival and a couple of other venues. Here are some images of that event in Bergen in 2019. And following that event, we continued the collaborative work back in Cardiff under the auspices of the Eastern DC project, and ran sort of workshop type events exploring sound processing, different synthesis techniques and so on, using my loudspeakers. With the onset of COVID, it wasn't possible to continue with too much collaborative work in the real world, so I began developing my own composition for the speakers. This used sounds collected from the spaces and places that inspired the speaker designs, as well as sounds collected from the making processes involved in their development. I made a short film to accompany the composition that serves as a visual reflection of the inspiration for the speaker's development and design. The whole body of work, including the loudspeaker building, the collaborative work, and my own composition and accompanying film, is called Resonant Forms.